Okay, this is the first of three Haldeman lectures, and you'll see the four things I'm going to cover here. And I know that many of you may not get to the Forever War this term. You may never get to it, and that's how it goes. You know, that's life. But you may be interested to see sort of where the discussion goes. So, I recommend seeing these lectures. Yeah. But then some of you will, and so again, the lectures may be interesting or not. So, as do what works for you. This first section, then, DX, Haldeman is. Some of you are familiar with Haldeman's poetry from 3440. And if you're not, it's no problem. It's just that you may be familiar with it. So this is familiar territory, because this is basically where the world begins for the Joe Haldeman that we essentially have as a writer. Okay, so Joe Haldeman went to Vietnam in 1968. And he was a college student. He had a science degree in physics and astronomy. And when he was drafted, he said he was a conscientious objector, a CO. And being a CO is a position you can take up with difficulty. The issue with claiming you're a conscientious objector is that at the time you had to have religious grounds. So they said to him basically, okay, what's your religion? Because it has to be against your religion to go and kill somebody. And he said, no, I'm an atheist. And they were like, oh, no religion? Off you go. So they drafted him and they sent him to Vietnam. And he was trained to be a combat engineer. In other words, he went into the regular army. He wasn't drafted. You don't get drafted into the Marines. You join the Marines. The regular army, you're drafted into that. And the army had less training. It had people who were less willing because they were drafted, more draftees. And they tended to be younger, and they tended to be more people of color. So as a result, they often had less education because they'd been forced out by poverty, unable to stay in school and that kind of thing. So being in the Army in 1968 was a very different proposition from being in the Marines. Anyway, he was trained as a combat engineer, which means that these are people who basically blow things down and up and certain things like that. So if you're going to land a helicopter in the jungle, you've got to clear a space for it. The combat engineers run explosive rope around the trees, basically, and blow them down. Are trained to use C4, detonate stuff. This kind of demolitions, basically. Right. So at the time, sometime in September of 1968, we don't know exactly what day it's lost now. Haldeman was tasked with, by a colonel, I think it was. It might have been a captain. And to have a captain out in the field is rare. I mean, it's dangerous, and you don't usually get command on the ground, and it's just very dangerous. They tend to fly in helicopters and surveil basically what the troops are doing, give orders to the lieutenants, and so on. Anyway, this captain ordered the men to guard a demolitions pile, which they had recently overrun Vietnamese forces base, and the VC had left behind an ammunition dump. And an ammunition is very common. I mean, they're called ammunition dumps. They're often an ammunition dump. It sounds like just sort of a pile of stuff, but it actually may be a warehouse or a couple of huts where you've got stacks of munitions of all kinds, artillery shells and grenades and munitions for guns and all kinds of things like that. Dangerous stuff. And you put it all in one place because you don't want, if it goes up, it goes up. It's like, that's it. You want it to go up at once, and you don't want to have an explosion over here set off explosions all over the camp. So you try to keep everything in one place. Okay. In this case, it actually was a pile of stuff, and so this would have been this is a different kind of dump. It's a dump where you put ammunition, which is or shells of munitions of any kind, explosives that are unreliable. So they might have gotten wet, or they're dirty and they're too dirty for you to clean. Or there's something wrong with a batch. Like the shells are duds. Like you put them into your artillery pieces and you fire them, and they don't go anywhere. So you have to. So now you've got a shell. You got to eject the shell, and it's been triggered. I mean, it's ready to go, and so it could cook off, as that's called. So you put all that stuff into one pile, away from where people are, and this is sometimes called a DX pile, ammunition dump, something like that. Various different names. And so this captain told the men in Holloman's squad to stand around it and guard this pile. So the other soldiers were basically, it was chow time, it was lunch, so they lined up to get chow. And these people were tasked with standing around this ammunition dump, which was completely useless and pointless. And it went off, basically. And Haldeman does not know whether it was a booby trap, which it could have been. It might have been wired for sound. It might have been command detonated. There might have been a wire, leading off into the jungle nearby, and there were people watching it and saying, okay, we've got 20 people standing around this thing, blow it, and they did. So it's impossible to know. But the result was that all but 3 people were immediately killed. Haldeman was one of the 3 who survived. And the other 2, one of them didn't make it. And the third guy disappeared. He made it, but as far as we know, but they never met. Haldeman was severely wounded, and that was it. I mean, he was a wreck. I mean, he was shot. He was basically covered. He was filled with metal, and one side of his. As a result, when you go and talk to Haldeman, you have to be on his right side because he's deaf, because that's the side that was facing the pile. His left side is also full of these pockmarks, which looks like super bad acne. That sort of, except it's internal, so it's like you see these sort of pockmarks that go inside. And these are all where their metal is all still there, and they don't bother getting out. I mean, they don't. The surgeons are like, no, we've taken care of this stuff. Just your body will reject it or will live with it, and so all down the left side of his body. And so then Haldeman he would have been stabilized, as they call it, on a Navy ship in the Gulf of in the South China Sea, and then flown to Japan. The worst cases were flown to Japan, and there he would have gone through a number of surgeries and then recovery, which I think took 6 months. I again, the dates are unclear. We looked into this. I needed some answers about this some time ago when I was doing some writing about him, and so I said, Joe, when did this actually happen? So we went into it. Okay, so he then the first thing he did was he wrote a novel about his wartime experience, which is very common. I mentioned this when we were talking about O'Brien. So he wrote a novel called War Year, which was intended for a juvenile audience, that is, for an audience of, say, teens, to explain sort of what, in simple language, what a war year looked like for an infantryman. And the main character's name is John Farmer. Okay, and it's a fairly basic sort of discursive Vietnam War novel about a young man who ultimately gets killed. Actually, he doesn't survive. And then he wrote in 3 novellas the story that became the Forever War. That made him an instant hit. The book was a massive success. It appeared at the right time, the way that Slaughterhouse-Five did. I mean, Slaughterhouse-Five came out in '69. Forever War came out between 74 and 75 because it was published serially. And by the time it came out, it was winning awards, and Haldeman became a star. And he really sort of, that was the beginning of his career as a writer, as a professional writer. So he also writes poems, this is fairly obvious. And so here are a few pieces from his poem DX, which, as I mentioned, some of you know this poem maybe quite well. And so here's a piece that's X-rays or engineers, demolition men, us. And so if you say, this is sort of an attempt here to translate for the civilian what battlefield slang sounds like, or the short forms sound like, and so on. So this tends to be a sort of handbook. It's like on this side it's the civilian, and on that side it's the military sort of thing, as if you've got French on one side of the column, English on the other. X-rays or engineers, demolition men, us. So they would just say, call the X-rays. Charlie is the enemy, so they're separated, right? Because Charlie is Victor Charles, VC, Viet Cong. Because of VC, Viet Cong, and because that became VC, when that goes out over the radio, you have to use the military alphabet, which is Victor Charles, Victor for V for Victor, Victor for V, and C, Charles, Charlie for C. DX means destroy. A DX pile is a collection of explosives that are no longer trustworthy, and you blow it up. Both motherfucker and DX are technical terms that serve as polite euphemisms. Private, you want to DX that motherfucker. Instead of private, kill that man. We then move on. Okay, so this is what the page looks like. And it's important that you see this poem is organized. It is organized. It's not just a line of poetry. Haldeman is very careful with form, and he uses form always in relates to form and structure always relate to content for Haldeman because he is interested in that. So this tends to operate in clusters, and because the pieces are separated. They are supposed to be separated. You don't get close to any man, and so on. So things are separated so that there's sort of the event, the explosion, which is. It can't be processed. It's just so much. I mean, the senses are just completely overwhelmed. It sounds so loud you don't hear it really. Gray smoke, blood. It's like these are sort of the outcomes. They're kind of floating around. It just hits you like a car. And so there's this, very powerful, contradictory juxtaposition of the floating things and the image of the car just bashing through. And then there's sort of what happens to the different men. And so Professor, and anybody who had any schooling was sort of automatically called professor in Vietnam, especially in the Army, not so much in the Marines, but in the Army, yes, because remember that most of the men were between 17 and 19. At this point, Haldeman was 26. So as far as they were concerned, he was an old man. He was a pipe smoker, and he'd been to college. And so they were like, professor. Which ironically he did become. I mean, he became a professor, and he taught at MIT, the other MIT, for 20 years as a writing a professional, as a writing teacher, creative writing teacher. And since I didn't have enough breath for a complete catalog, foot, shins, knees, thigh, groin, genitals, arm, ear, scalp, and disposition, I settled for the balls. Oh my God, Farmer said. Then he died. And this is the struggle that in this third image you'll see, And so it was over in a way, the whole squad DX but me. And the ending, and then there are these two endings of this poem. The ending which Haldeman stands by, and I think this is the true ending of the text, which is here. There's nothing for it. There's nothing you can take for it. They are names on a wall now. This is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. They are composed in Arlington, which is the military cemetery, which is massive, also in Washington, and somehow I am not. This is really, as far as I'm concerned, the ending of the poem. But the poem then goes on to imagine sort of alternate universes in which each one has survived except for Haldeman, and he is at peace. And this is how Haldeman's experience in Vietnam ended, and it formed the basis for at least the next, I don't know, 5, maybe 6 novels, one way or another. So when we look at the Forever War, the question is often, are we looking at a biography? And the answer to that is no. But much is made of the fact that Haldeman's name is a rough anagram for Mandela or vice versa. So that would look like this. Here's a slide of that. And that's a dangerous game to play, to suggest that Mandela and Haldeman are the same being. And in fact, as you know by now from O'Brien's story, you can't make that assumption. Nobody can make that assumption. Same thing with Vonnegut. So it's interesting here that we have the same sort of sets of issues where we can look at, we could say, well, Forever War is an encoded biography or autobiography of Haldeman's experience in Vietnam, but that's not really right. And he's now written over 18 novels and books of poetry, film scripts, and at the center of Haldeman's universe is war.